Oh, I beg your pardon. Well, welcome once more, my friends. Welcome to Al Monticello. And welcome particularly to today's subject, enlightenment. Oh, what is it? It is simply that in all of our lives and throughout indeed the universe, there is great light. And many gentlemen here I know realize light and liberty go together. But enlightenment takes so many various forms, particularly in the pursuit of science, of becoming known today as paleontology, as I knew it as natural philosophy. So it continues to grow and evolve through, well, generations yet to come. I beg your pardon, I'm becoming preoccupied in my own interest here, and I've become somewhat apologetic that you found me seated here. I hope I may remain so, ladies. I've often said a gentleman would never take a chair in the company of ladies unless he first asked them that he be invited to do so. And when we talk about enlightenment and science, we also need to realize that this is such a necessary element of it. It is a safety and protection, let alone a convenience of the pursuit of science that helps us better to understand and to work with the elements of nature to overcome natural pestilence. So may I ask you, would you be so kind to allow me to remove this so that I might be better understood? Thank you. Thank you very much. Oh, well, that's better. Well, citizens, I look forward to your questions today upon this subject of enlightenment. And to help us moderate, we're delighted to welcome Melanie Boyer here as our moderator. So thank you, Ms. Boyer, for being with us. And without any further comment from me upon the subject, without first the questions from our friends, let us engage the very first question.
Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. I'm happy to be with you today. So you have been described as a man of the Enlightenment. I know you touched on this a little bit, but can you expound on what you consider the Enlightenment to mean?
What do I consider the Enlightenment to mean? Sapere aude. Sapere aude. It is, in my opinion, the motto of the Enlightenment. It means question everything. Be so bold to question everything. Engage human reason, engage common sense, engage objective observation, all of it together in order to improve the condition of mankind. The Enlightenment means no longer keep yourself in darkness, no longer keep yourself in superstition, such as cries of rawhead and bloody bones, the support of fear, and an encouragement of fear, because fear only emanates from ignorance. That means unknowing. Fear is conjured up. You cannot hand it to me. I cannot return it to you. So the only thing we would have to fear. Exactly. So that is, in my opinion, enlightenment. Be so bold to question everything. Follow truth wherever it should lead us. The next question.
So who do you consider to be some of the most important thinkers of the Enlightenment? And how did you come to be familiar with them?
Some of the most important thinkers of the Enlightenment. Well, you know, Alexander Pope, whose poems I certainly favor, once wrote, nature and nature's laws were hidden in the night. Then God said, let Newton be. And there was light. So certainly I think amongst the foremost thinkers of what has become known as the enlightenment of the mind of man is Sir Isaac Newton. His work, the Principia, enables us to continue to move forward into the future. I have often mentioned two others that I consider just equally as important, and that would be Mr. John Locke and Sir Francis Bacon. Now, all three of these individuals, all three, granted, are Englishmen. They go beyond the ancient authors, because the ancient authors, though I thoroughly enjoy them and have often considered myself an antique Roman, well, the ancient authors were always besieged by the idea they were continually wrestling with the gods. They were overcome often by fate. But the modern authors, the enlightenment of man, engage reason, be so bold to question everything, helps man to move forward into the future. Newton's Principia helps us to calculate the future. We may not know a sum, but insert a variable. Sir Francis Bacon's essays, Civil and Moral, help us to realize nature never puts before us so much of a calamity, so much that may besiege us, where she has not already given us the opportunity to search through more extensively and precisely to discover how we may overcome it and succeed. And then, of course, Locke, well, he's the answer to the improvement of government amongst mankind. And that is simply the realization no government anywhere at any time will long survive unless it recognizes its justice to govern, its reason to govern, comes from the people. The people. Governments emanate from the people. And further thinkers of the Enlightenment, if you will, the French, Montesquieu and Montaigne, Rousseau, Voltaire, they all believed in kind. It is the people. Search out the common sense amongst the people. A Scot by the name of Thomas Reed purported the very same thing in objection to David Hume, another two individuals influential in the Enlightenment. That the common sense, that's why it's referred to as common sense. We all have it. It's almost an innate instinct. I've frequently said if people would simply think for themselves and speak what they think, they'd find they have more in common than they would otherwise believe. Now, Ms. Boyle, you have asked me where did I become acquainted with these individuals, or even with the term enlightenment, or even the term sapere aude. Well, education. Education is truly the greatest element of the enlightenment of the mind of man. And I was fortunate, and only fortunate, because my family had the means. I was able to receive an education. And I've always looked back and thought, oh, my heavens, it was the influence of my teacher at William and Mary. He was the one who had, I would venture, the greatest influence upon me. His name was Dr. William Small. I've written about him many times. I've spoken about him in conversation, as I do now. And here is a tripartite description of his character, which in my opinion bespeaks enlightenment. First and foremost, he had gentlemanly and correct manners. The Romans said manners make the man. Now, is that any less important in any era, at any time, in this modern world? And coincidentally, the Enlightenment is looked upon as the beginning of what we and myself call the modern world. Good manners are even more important now, particularly in our nation, while the eyes of the world are upon us to see whether we are capable of handling self-government. It's a matter of how we treat one and the other. Enlightenment, good manners. Secondly, as I've written, Dr. Small had an enlarged and a liberal mind. Yeah. I've had certain individuals say, I beg your pardon, Mr. Jefferson, do not become political. Well, I replied, what do you mean? They say, well, you mentioned the word liberal. And I say, well, yes, you are correct. But do not forget the definition of liberal. It comes from the Latin word libertas, and it means exactly freedom, liberty of the human mind. The greatest vehicle of liberty and freedom any individual possesses. Not a soul can take it away from you without your consent. And see here, talking about good common sense, it takes just as much energy to be happy as it does to be miserable. And lastly, as I have written about Dr. Small, he had a happy talent for communication. He made learning an enjoyable adventure. We're a curious creature, and how are we going to know unless... And so that is why I look back on him, as I've written many times, perhaps more than any other, he fixed my destinies. And do you know that when he left the old Royal College of William and Mary, I believe it was about 1764, he returned to England, took up residence in Birmingham, and he became a member of the Lunar Society. The Lunar Men, they were a coterie of gentlemen dedicated to scientific investigation and observation, a coterie of gentlemen devoted to enlightenment. In their numbers was Matthew Bolton. In fact, the Lunar Men met at his house, Soho House in Birmingham. There was Dr. Joseph Priestley, a good friend of mine, who assimilated, if you will, the principles of the Enlightenment and scientific investigation with religion. and the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, who helps open our minds. Erasmus Darwin was one of the lunar men. Josiah Wedgwood, Dr. James Watt. In fact, Dr. Watt and my teacher became good friends, and they both collaborated on observations of steam and what eventually became the steam engine. And do you know who else was a member? Dr. Benjamin Franklin. He attended to the Lunar Society meetings in Birmingham when he was living in England. Now, I should not want to forget George Wythe. Oh, my friend of all hours. We spent much time together. I read law with him for 3 years. He would only take one student for that period of time. And I learned through him the foundation of English common law, an enlightenment, if you will, for generations yet unborn, because English common law continues to grow along with every successive generation. And it's even founded on the Justinian Code of Law, that first civil body of law provided for civilized man in the Western world. And the foundation simply, all men are born free. Everyone is born free. Everyone. Everyone comes into this world with a right to their own person and to move wherever they choose to improve their condition. I learned that from Mr. Wythe as a foundation of law, that we're all born free in nature, but we're born into the laws of man. And yet the Enlightenment helps us to make it better, to rectify that in order that we might imitate the laws of nature throughout the family of man. And then Mr. Wythe helped me understand that laws are living and breathing. They grow as we grow as a people. As I wrote Elbridge Gerry, we should not go back to the ages of the darkest ignorance to discover the greatest enlightenment, or that anything that was created in the past cannot be improved upon in the present and through future generations. And that means everything, not only law, but morals and education and ethics. All of this continue to evolve and be improved upon in order to be more applicable to the pursuit of happiness and the protection, safety, and defense of the individual and their inherent rights for a more equal and exact justice. That was Mr. Wythe. He continues to hold great influence in my life. Your next question.
So we talked a lot about some gentlemen during the Enlightenment, but Bridget would like to know about women's contributions to the Enlightenment.
Well, Bridget, I will tell you this. I could hardly ignore the ladies' influence, if you will, in the continued influence of enlightenment, the enlightenment of the mind of man. Several come to mind. Afra Ben, of course, a lady who had much to say with respect to literature that encouraged the enlightenment of man. I think also of Mrs. Causeway, Mrs. Maria Causeway. I knew her distinctly. In fact, if you will, Bridget, I have a very fine rendering of her here, almost as if I knew you might ask this question, but here she is. Now, this is a portrait of enlightenment. Look at the natural attention the artist has provided for this. And you know, this has been done, we believe, by herself, almost as a self-portrait, or if not, by her husband, Mr. Richard Causeway, a well-known miniature artist throughout the kingdoms of Europe. But Mrs. Causeway was a lady that was devoted to the arts, had a curiosity in science, and was most amenable in society. And do you know, when we speak of female authors, she well knew a particular work that I knew called A Conversation Between the Head and the Heart. Well, I don't know whether you realize this, Bridget, but the last time I saw Mrs. Causeway, when I helped her into her carriage in Paris, I thought I may never see her again. I went immediately to my chambers and I penned for her A Conversation Between My Head and My Heart. Now there is a conversation that one would have in the realms of enlightenment. What ought to be our guide? Our heart or our head? You know, the antithesis of enlightenment is often the idea that our passions overwhelm us, that we cannot separate our passions from who we are. But then, of course, the head helps to guide that with reason and understanding. and for the improvement of a relationship between two people, rather than the dulling of it to attentive to passion. And that is what Mrs. Causeway represented to me in our continuing friendship. Oh, yes, we continue to correspond with one and the other. And I'm reminded that I have a rather overly large painting in the parlor at Monticello. I refer to it as the Herodias, meaning, of course, that Herodias, of course, was the woman who had quite the affection and passion for John the Baptist. Well, she came up with a scheme that she would allow her daughter Salome to dance in front of King Herod. Oh, and when Herod was so moved by the dance, then he asked Salome, "What would you want? Any wish is yours." So the daughter procured from him the wish of her mother to have the head of John the Baptist presented in a platter. I saw this when I was in France. I saw the initial rendering. I thought it was by Vouet, the esteemed French painter, but they tell me no, that it was probably done by Rene, Guido Rene. But I have a very fine copy of it, and believe me, it reminds me of what could very well be a problem with enlightenment, a separation between the head and the heart. No, in my opinion, they need to work together. Your next question.
So here's a fun one. Cynthia would like to know about some of the most important scientific discoveries of your day.
I think one of the most important discoveries in the pursuit of science, I believe, is realizing that these fossilized and hardened elements of life, natural life, have taken a great deal of time to occur. This particular turtle shell, if you call it, terrapin, whatever, this was found in the tidewater of Virginia. And a good 15 feet below the ground of the lowest lands in the tidewater of Virginia, you will find great collections of fossils. You will find vertebrae of whale. You will find shark and shark teeth. You will find large scallop shells and a smaller variety. I think I mentioned in a previous gathering that my name has been affixed to the larger variety in the Linnaean nomenclature, and there Corollas Linnaeus is another individual who engages the Enlightenment, a scientific phraseology of what we discover in nature, both flora and fauna. So the large scallop cells have been named Chesapeake Jeffersonians, and then I've applied the same Linnaean nomenclature to the smaller variety, Chesapeake Madisonians. But the point of the matter is, how long did it take for this form of life to be fossilized into rock? Was it only 4,000 years? Now, if so, why is it that we find shells on the top of the Blue Ridge Mountains? Did they get there because of a great flood, 40 days or 40 nights? Or were the tops of the mountains once the beds of the oceans? And by some convulsion in nature, were they pushed up to form what we find the mountains? And did that occur in 4,000? I leave it up to you. Science continues to improve. I will follow it wherever it should lead us. But I myself have raised this question. I think of the philosopher of the Germanies, Otto von Guericke, I believe his name may be pronounced. He created what is known as the air pump. I have an example of it in my parlor at Monticello. Oh, and it can be used for, society gatherings and somewhat exciting the mind with what can happen to little birds may be placed within it. And it forms then, as you crank it up, a vacuum. But then we can resuscitate that life, of course, with the air within. Well, von Guericke, of course, created this as something through which we could study respiration, if you will, and combustion accordingly with oxygen. And who can discount, of course, Dr. Benjamin Franklin, our own, in discovering that we might harness electricity by simply attaching a key to a kite, flying the kite with a storm to commence, and bolts of lightning to be attracted to the key and carry the current down. You know, when I was visiting Como in the north of the Italies, in the most beautiful, serene body of water I think I have ever seen, well, I was aware of Monsieur Volta, Alessandro Volta, who lived there and was able to harness electricity in the form of what is called a battery. So you see, there are many individuals who have created many things by which we benefit, and not least of whom I made mention several visits ago, an Englishman, Hawkins, who devised a polygraph, no, not a lie detector, but the improvement to make a copy of a letter that you are writing so that you will always have your thoughts ready there to refer to if anyone might think you are contradicting yourself, which happens to me. Your next question.
So you talked a little bit about the separation of church and state, but many Enlightenment thinkers propose that not only political but also religious authorities should not hold absolute power. Can you talk about how this impacted your views on the separation of church and state in the American Republic?
Yes, thank you for that question. That's a very, very important question, particularly relevant to a founding principle of our nation. And I hope we do not forget our nation is the first in the history of man founded upon the principles of the enlightenment of the mind of man. When you think of the number of people who throughout the ages have sought to escape the ancient tumults and calamities of European kingdoms where one particular religious opinion reigned on the throne and imposed upon the liberty of their mind to carry their communion with their Maker as they should choose, that is, the subjects of that particular kingdom, they fled. And what did they seek? They sought a religious asylum here in the former British colonies of North America. And yet, even here in those colonies, we were beholden unto the Church of England, with two exceptions, Pennsylvania and Rhode Island. But we certainly could live more freely here. And in time, with so many more seeking this asylum here, so many different peoples of different religious opinions, we began to realize this is inherent in nature. This is the desire of our Creator, to hold our opinions with Him freely and thereby to freely worship Him. And so, who else but myself, and there were one or two others, Mr. Madison included, realized that we can no longer pay a tax to the support of one church and its association of ecclesiastical laws with the civil authority over all other churches. And that is the premise for drafting the Statute of Virginia for Religious Freedom, to protect and defend the liberty of the human mind, to help us realize that our Creator created our minds free. And free, He desires it to remain, incapable of any temporal restraint. And what has history shown? What did our ancestors have to suffer? But whenever any government, whenever any association of laws imposes upon the liberty of the mind of man and coerces them to worship one religious opinion over another, or to pay support to one religious opinion over another, well, history will show it only results in instances of hypocrisy, meanness, and bloodshed. Now then, a caution lest we become too comfortable in pronouncing separation of church and state. I do not want to imply that. The semantics is important here. I did not write separation of church and state. I wrote precisely separation between. I wrote it in a reply to a coterie of Danbury Baptists who wrote me during my first administration as president whether the Constitution of our nation supersedes the Constitution of Connecticut, which still held them to pay a tithing, a tax, to the support of the Congregationalist Church. These were Baptists. Well, I wrote back and hoped that they would bear with patience until the Constitution of Connecticut could ally itself with the Constitution of our nation, particularly the First Amendment, which is the law of the land. And then I wrote to them, no one more than myself would rather see a great wall of separation be built between church and state, not a separation of. Between is necessary to help us understand that separating between the ecclesiastical laws and the civil authority. That provides much more liberty, much more freedom, particularly for the human mind to worship as they choose. Because the only purpose of the civil authority, its government, its laws, is to protect people from injury by one and the other. Otherwise, leave them free to pursue their own industry and their own improvement, and their improvement will be the most successful when the ecclesiastical laws are free to allow people to worship as they choose. So I hope I have made that more clear. I hope that we may never forget the Enlightenment helped us to better understand a toleration of religious opinion. It is a result, if you will, the Enlightenment of the great Reformation, the glorious revolution, the invention of the printing press, if you will, newspapers. I remember that when I had the opportunity to visit Strasbourg, this was after I sailed down the Rhine and I disembarked at Strasbourg, there I became aware of the printing press and the fact that Strasbourg was a center for newspapers from various European kingdoms to come together that enlightened the people more about what was happening throughout all of the kingdoms of Europe. So again, a larger, a greater awareness, an opening of the mind is so very necessary to understand religious toleration and more precisely, freedom for religion. The next question.
So while discussing the rights of man, Enlightenment thinkers have also debated slavery. How is slavery linked to the Enlightenment? And do you think there are other areas where Enlightenment thinking might have had some negative effects?
Yes. May I say nothing could be more linked, if you will, to the Enlightenment than the abolishing of this despicable institution of slavery. I have written that. I stand behind it. And yet I may not be the best example of what to do about it, and I will acknowledge that. However, the Enlightenment has brought about the understanding that, well, nothing is more assuredly written in the book of faith than these people ought to be free. It helps us to understand that our Creator is a just God. He cannot but abhor the institution of slavery. And when do we begin to tremble in recognition His justice will not sleep forever? Now, I'm not saying that there are those who do believe slavery is wrong and yet have comments, definitive comments, about a particular race enslaved, which, of course, is something that occurred in the age of the Enlightenment with the Spaniards and the Dutch and the British, and now we are the inheritors. Voltaire was one to make definitive statements about certain intelligence relevant to a comparison of different races, so to speak. And even I myself have made statements and yet continue to raise the question. Raise the question. Be so bold to question everything. It is entering into that open and free inquiry that we may be proven wrong and gain a better understanding. So, curiously, in a great contradiction, whereas the Quakers, initially the Baptists and the Methodists, moved forward to seek an abolishing of slavery and emancipation of one particular race, bound in servitude for life, let alone to abolish slavery everywhere upon the globe, the contradiction happens when we become too free, perhaps, to write a definitive statement upon the subject of the intelligence of man and forget that our Creator created our mind free. Free, He desires it to remain. So I hope that may help us better understand the contradictions that enlightenment can also bring. Your next question.
Well, actually, that's all we have time for today, Mr. Jefferson. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ms. Boyer, and thank you for venturing to visit with us again here today. I look forward to meeting with you in the future, and also I hope that you might have your opinions upon various subjects of scientific investigation, that we might move forward in this effort. Follow science wherever it should lead us. I remain your humble and obedient servant, and I think I will now return this to my cabinet of curiosity. Good day.